Hello and welcome to Cognitive Drift. Freedom sounds beautiful, but it's also heavy, and that weight is exactly what many people try to escape. This is where religion enters the picture, offering answers that feel certain, rules that feel safe, and meaning that seems handed down from something greater than us. But the question we need to ask is simple. Is this guidance truly for you, or is it for them? Religion is one of the oldest systems of control humans have ever built. It promises comfort and community, but those promises come at a cost. And here's the hard truth. Almost everything about organized belief has been engineered, not necessarily in some dark conspiracy, but through centuries of trial and error. Human psychology has been studied long before psychology became a science. Religious systems discovered what makes people compliant, what makes them obedient, and what makes them stop asking questions. That's not a coincidence. Start with fear. At its core, fear is the most basic tool of manipulation. Ancient religions knew this long before fear was mapped in the amygdala. If you want someone to behave, don't just give them a suggestion. Give them eternal consequences. Tell them their soul depends on obedience, that every thought, every slip-up is being monitored by an all-seeing eye. That's surveillance on a scale no government has ever managed. It's not just that you might get punished in this life. The punishment is cosmic, endless, and invisible, which means you can never prove it wrong, and you can never really escape it. But fear alone is exhausting. Too much fear, and people start breaking. So religion mixes fear with hope. Heaven is the ultimate carrot after the ultimate stick. You live in pain now, but someday you'll walk streets of gold. Just behave, just believe, just keep going, and the reward will come after death. The brilliance here is that the reward is never delivered in this life, so there's no way to check if the promise was real. If any other system told you, work for us your whole life, and you'll get paid after you die, you'd laugh. But when that paycheck is eternal bliss, people stop laughing. Then comes guilt. Guilt is softer than fear, but just as powerful. Religion teaches you that being human is by default wrong. You're broken from birth, sinful by nature. The moment you accept that narrative, you need their solution. You need cleansing, forgiveness, rituals, confessions, prayers. Suddenly, you're in a loop where the problem and the cure are sold by the same system, and this isn't an accident. Guilt keeps you coming back. It makes sure you never feel fully whole without them. Now, look at how these systems use identity. Humans crave belonging. We're tribal creatures, wired to feel safe in groups. Religion taps into that need and turns it into loyalty. It's not just believe in this God, it's you are this belief. It becomes your badge, your flag, your family's pride, and once your identity is wrapped up in faith, leaving it feels like tearing out a piece of yourself. That's not spirituality, that's social engineering. And when identity is strong enough, something else happens. Outsiders become threats. This is how religions divide, by labeling non-believers as lost, dangerous, or even evil. It creates an us versus them mentality that cements the in-group. And here's the twist. This division makes people more dependent on the group, because the world outside feels hostile. If you leave, you're not just questioning ideas, you're betraying your tribe, and betrayal comes with shame, isolation, sometimes even violence. Control isn't just about ideas, though. It's also about your time, your money, your relationships. Religious institutions have historically tied themselves to power and wealth for a reason. Donations, tithes, offerings, these are framed as acts of devotion, but they create financial streams that keep the system alive. When you give money to a church, you think you're giving to God, but the funds pay for infrastructure, leadership salaries, and sometimes even lobbying to influence laws. This isn't theory, this is documented history, and the pattern repeats across cultures and centuries. But maybe the most subtle form of manipulation is epistemic, meaning who controls what counts as truth. Religion often sets itself up as the authority on reality. You're told not to trust your senses, your doubts, or the evidence in front of you because human reason is flawed. Instead, trust the book, trust the leader, trust the tradition. Once that framework is in place, questioning isn't just risky, it's sinful. And that's the perfect mechanism for silencing dissent. You don't need force when you can make people police their own thoughts. So why does this work so well? Because it answers the hardest questions we face. Why am I here? What happens when I die? What is the purpose of all this? These questions don't have easy answers, and most people would rather have a wrong answer than no answer. Religion doesn't just fill gaps in knowledge, it fills emotional gaps. It makes chaos feel ordered, suffering feel meaningful, and randomness feel intentional. That's comforting, but comfort is not the same as truth. When comfort becomes the main selling point, truth becomes secondary. And once truth stops being the priority, almost anything can be justified. That's how religion ends up shaping morality in ways that seem noble, but are rooted in control. Think about it. Most religious moral codes aren't really about kindness or compassion. They're about obedience. They teach that good and evil are defined by divine command, not by consequences, not by empathy, which means morality becomes less about human well-being and more about following rules, even when those rules cause harm. This is why you see moral blind spots baked into religious systems. In some traditions, telling the truth matters less than defending the faith. Loving your neighbor sounds good until that neighbor belongs to a different faith or loves the wrong person. The rules change depending on who holds power, and the interpretation always seems to favor the institution. When morality is dictated from above, people stop thinking critically about ethics. They outsource their conscience to an authority. And when that authority gets it wrong, entire societies suffer. Another layer of manipulation lies in ritual. Rituals seem harmless, lighting a candle, reciting a prayer, performing a ceremony. But rituals do more than mark traditions. They reinforce identity, solidify group cohesion, and create psychological anchors. The more time and energy you invest in these repeated acts, the harder it is to let go. It's the sunk cost effect in action. After years of rituals, walking away doesn't feel like a rational choice. It feels like betraying everything you've invested in. And institutions know this, whether they say it or not. Then there's the concept of sacredness. Declaring something sacred sounds innocent, even beautiful. But look closer. Once an idea, text, or symbol is labeled sacred, it's placed beyond criticism. It becomes untouchable, and if you can't question it, you can't truly understand it. That's the shield religion uses to protect its most fragile ideas. Wrap them in holiness so tight that doubt feels like a crime. This is how even flawed texts or outdated traditions survive centuries without serious scrutiny. Let's not ignore the role of authority figures. Priests, imams, pastors, gurus, whatever the title, these figures hold enormous influence. Often they're seen as intermediaries between the divine and the human. That status gives them power that no politician could dream of, because it's not just your vote or your money they want, it's your conscience. When someone claims to speak for God, disagreeing with them feels like disagreeing with God. That's an almost unbeatable advantage in persuasion. And history is full of examples where that advantage was abused. From selling indulgences in medieval Europe to modern televangelists promising miracles for a love offering, the pattern repeats. Spiritual authority converted into material gain. But manipulation doesn't have to look like a scam. Sometimes it's wrapped in genuine sincerity. That's the trickiest part. Many religious leaders truly believe they're helping, and maybe they are, in their own framework. But good intentions don't erase the mechanisms of control. In fact, they make the system even more effective, because sincerity is harder to question than greed. Another psychological lever religion pulls is existential dependency. You're told you can't truly be good without faith, that morality, meaning, and even love are incomplete without God. This isn't just an idea, it's a deep, programmed insecurity. It trains people to see themselves as incapable of flourishing on their own. And when you believe you're broken without something, you'll cling to it, even when it hurts you. That's the same dynamic you see in toxic relationships, only on a cultural scale. What's fascinating is how adaptable religion is. It survives scientific revolutions, cultural shifts, political upheavals. Because it evolves its strategies. When fear of hell loses traction, it leans into personal purpose. When people stop trusting blind authority, it rebrands as spirituality. This flexibility isn't random, it's survival. Every time humanity takes a step forward, religion adjusts just enough to stay relevant. And that tells you something important. If these ideas were eternal truths, they wouldn't need constant updates. The fact that they adapt is proof that the system is human-made. Let's also talk about childhood. Most people don't choose their religion, they inherit it from parents, from culture, from geography, and this early conditioning is incredibly powerful. By the time you're old enough to question, the ideas have fused with your sense of self. That's why religious indoctrination focuses so heavily on kids. Sunday schools, youth groups, memorized verses, not because children understand theology, but because they absorb identity. A child raised to believe questioning is dangerous will grow into an adult who avoids doubt instinctively. That's not faith, that's programming. And when doubt does creep in, guilt rushes to crush it. You start to think something's wrong with you, not the system. That's one of the most brilliant manipulations of all, the ability to turn suspicion inward instead of outward, to make people doubt themselves instead of the claims they were taught. That's how the cycle sustains itself, generation after generation. If you follow the money, you see another layer of how this system holds power. Religion has always been deeply tied to economics, not just through donations and tithes, but through land ownership, tax exemptions, and influence over laws that shape entire economies. Some of the wealthiest institutions on the planet are religious, and that's not an accident. When you create a structure that collects from millions or even billions of followers, and that money comes in regularly without expecting tangible goods in return, you've built a financial engine that rivals global corporations. And unlike a business, religion often enjoys tax privileges. In many countries, it pays nothing to the state while lobbying for policies that affect everyone. That means believers and non-believers alike end up living under systems influenced by organizations that aren't financially accountable. Think about that. They hold sway over laws about education, healthcare, even who can marry whom. Not because they were elected by everyone, but because they speak with the voice of something sacred. That's not democracy, that's soft theocracy in disguise. Now consider the political alliances. Religion doesn't just adapt to culture, it partners with power. In history, kings claimed divine rights, empires spread faith with armies, and today, politicians still leverage religious identity to win votes. Why? Because nothing mobilizes like belief. Convince someone that your campaign is blessed or your opponent is ungodly, and suddenly politics becomes a moral battlefield instead of a policy debate that turns citizens into soldiers, and soldiers don't ask many questions. And this isn't just history, it happens now in debates over reproductive rights, gender equality, education curricula. Arguments dressed in religious language end up shaping laws that govern everyone. The manipulation here is subtle. It makes people think they're defending eternal truths when they're really defending cultural preferences tied to power structures. Those preferences could change, and often do, but the rhetoric of divine will gives them an armor no secular argument could match. But what about modern societies that claim to be secular? Are they immune? Not even close. Because while traditional religious institutions may lose influence, the psychological patterns they perfected don't vanish. They resurface in new forms. Charismatic movements, personality cults, even some wellness and self-help circles that mimic the same structures. Unquestionable leaders, sacred texts, promises of transformation. The packaging changes, but the levers remain. Fear, hope, guilt, identity. Humanity's oldest buttons keep getting pressed. So why do we fall for this? Partly because the human mind craves certainty. We're uncomfortable with ambiguity. The universe is vast, chaotic, indifferent, and that's hard to swallow. Religion offers a shortcut, a story that makes sense of it all, and when that story comes with a community, rituals, and a moral map, it feels like relief. But relief isn't proof, and that's the central problem. What feels true isn't always what is true. Here's another angle that rarely gets discussed: opportunity cost. Every hour spent in rituals, every dollar given to an institution, every law shaped by dogma, Those choices have real consequences. Resources that could fund science, education, or healthcare get funneled into maintaining belief systems. Talent that could innovate solutions gets tied up defending ancient texts. When a society invests more in saving souls than solving problems, progress slows. And this isn't theory, you can measure it. Nations with lower religiosity often rank higher in education, healthcare, and human rights. That correlation isn't random. But beyond the social cost, there's a personal one. When your worldview is outsourced to an authority, you stop building your own. When answers are handed to you, the muscles of curiosity and skepticism atrophy. That's tragic, because those muscles are what drive human growth. They're why we left caves, why we mapped the stars, why we split the atom. And yet, billions are taught that questioning is dangerous, that doubt is weakness, that thinking for yourself is a path to ruin that's not guidance. That's intellectual sabotage. And here's the irony. The very questions religion tries to silence are the ones that make life richer. What if I'm wrong? Isn't a threat. It's a doorway. Because when you walk through that doorway, you start seeing reality as it is, not as you wish it to be. And that's where authentic meaning begins. Not in borrowed answers, but in the courage to search, to accept uncertainty, to create purpose instead of inheriting it. Some people hear this and think the goal is to strip life of wonder, but it's the opposite. The cosmos doesn't become less awe-inspiring when you understand it. It becomes more. A galaxy isn't less beautiful because you know it's made of hydrogen and helium. It's more beautiful because you realize you're made of the same stuff. You don't need divine permission to feel profound connection. Reality, as it is already staggering. You just have to look without the filter of dogma. And here's where it all comes together. Manipulation works best when you don't know you're being manipulated. When control feels like care, when obedience feels like virtue, when fear feels like love. That's the brilliance of the system and the danger. But the antidote isn't rage, and it isn't blind rebellion, it's awareness. It's the quiet, radical act of asking, is this true? Does this serve life, or just the system? Every time someone asks those questions honestly, the spell breaks a little. And that's how real freedom starts. Not with a miracle, but with a question. Let's look at the psychology behind why these systems stick so stubbornly. One key reason is cognitive bias. The human brain doesn't just absorb facts, it filters them. We're wired for confirmation bias, which means once we believe something, we seek evidence that supports it and ignore evidence that challenges it. Religion exploits this beautifully. It gives you a framework, then tells you doubt is dangerous. So when you experience anything, a coincidence, a burst of emotion, a stroke of luck, the framework interprets it as proof every prayer answered. Every sign, every survival after an accident becomes reinforcement. And every unanswered prayer, that's reframed too. It's a test of faith, a mystery, or your fault. The system is designed so it can never be falsified. Another bias in play is the authority bias. We tend to trust people who speak confidently, especially when they're framed as experts or moral leaders. Add robes, rituals, titles, and the weight of tradition and authority feels sacred. When someone speaks with absolute certainty about the ultimate questions of existence, it triggers a strange comfort, even when those claims have no evidence. That comfort isn't a sign of truth, it's a sign of our brain's preference for clarity over chaos. And then there's the sunk cost fallacy. If you've spent decades believing, giving, obeying, it feels unbearable to admit it might have been for nothing. The deeper the investment, the harder it is to walk away. People will defend beliefs not because they're true, but because abandoning them would unravel their sense of self. It's the psychological equivalent of doubling down at a losing game. Not because the odds improved, but because you can't stomach the loss. Here's something less discussed: the trauma bond. In some religious environments, fear and love are paired so tightly they become inseparable. You're told you're cherished unconditionally, but also that you deserve eternal punishment. That tension creates an emotional dependency. You cling harder to the very system that scares you, because it's also the one that promises safety. This is the same dynamic seen in abusive relationships, a cycle of harm and comfort that makes escape feel impossible. Only here, it's sanctified. Now, let's talk about apocalyptic narratives. End-time stories aren't just entertainment, they're psychological traps. They create urgency, making you feel the stakes are cosmic and time is running out. When people believe the world could end any moment, they're less likely to question, more likely to obey, and more willing to sacrifice. It's a control mechanism that works because it hijacks our survival instincts. Fear of death is powerful, fear of global annihilation is paralyzing. And when every news event is framed as a sign, that fear stays alive indefinitely. The slot machine does not allow that pause for people to suck in the details. You might wonder, if all of this is manipulation, why do people defend it so fiercely? Because manipulation that feels like meaning doesn't register as manipulation. If something gives you comfort, community, and purpose, it feels like a gift, not a cage. That's why logic alone rarely breaks the spell. You can show evidence, point out contradictions, explain historical origins, and people will still hold on because you're not just challenging ideas, you're challenging identity, belonging, and hope. And those are primal needs. But here's the thing, those needs are real. They're not weaknesses, they're part of being human. And that's why religion works. It doesn't invent the hunger for meaning, it feeds it. The question isn't whether we need meaning, it's whether we need illusions to have it. Do we need fear of hell to be moral? Do we need a cosmic plan to feel significant? Or can we build meaning from the raw material of reality, from our connections, our creativity, our brief but extraordinary existence on this tiny planet? The truth is, we can. In fact, when meaning isn't handed to you, you start creating it with intention. And that kind of meaning is resilient, because it isn't tied to dogma, it's tied to life itself, relationships, curiosity, acts of kindness, the pursuit of knowledge. These aren't eternal in the cosmic sense, but they're real, and sometimes real is enough, more than enough. This doesn't mean rejecting everything religion offers. Community, ritual, reflection, these can enrich life when they're chosen freely, without fear or coercion. The danger isn't in gathering or celebrating. It's in surrendering your mind to a system that claims authority over truth. That's when wonder turns into control and guidance turns into a leash. So here's where we land. If you strip away the language, the stories, the sacredness, what remains? Just people, vulnerable, searching, afraid of the dark but capable of lighting their own path. Religion tells you that light comes from outside, from something beyond you. But maybe the most liberating realization is that it doesn't. It comes from within, from the questions you dare to ask, the ideas you're brave enough to explore, the values you choose for yourself. Not because someone decreed them, but because you examined them and found them worth living by. When you see that, clearly, manipulation loses its grip. Fear shrinks, guilt fades, and what replaces them isn't emptiness, it's possibility. Because now life isn't a test, it's an experience, not a waiting room for eternity, but a chance. Fleeting, precious, irreplaceable, to exist, to love, to learn, to leave something better behind. And maybe that's all the meaning we need, not handed down, but built together, not promised, but lived.